Okay, so the rest of chapter 20 is all about errors that can occur in hypothesis testing. If you haven't already read the first couple of pages of the errors in the U.S. judicial system that's on your Schoology, you need to go back and take a look at that. But here we're going to look more in the context of the types of tests that we run in science, social sciences, business, those sorts of things. So when we run a hypothesis test, there are two things that are going on, two things that we're sort of comparing to each other. The first of which is the null hypothesis, which states some claim, some status quo. The percentage is 20%, the percentage of 50%. There's not been a change. Things are the same as they always were. Now, there's only two things that can happen with a null hypothesis. It's either true or it's false. Either 20% of the people wear their seatbelts, or 20% of the people don't wear their seatbelts. That there's only truth or non-truth. There's no in between. So the null hypothesis is either true or false. There's no probability attached to it. It either is or it isn't. It's really the alternate hypothesis that we can make some claims about otherwise. Okay, so we have this null hypothesis that's true or false, and we never really know which one it is. If we knew whether it was true or false, we wouldn't conduct a test to start with. After examining a sample, we make some decision about that. So based on a sample, we can decide that we believe the null is true or that we believe the null is not true. So that decision could go one of two ways. We could make the right decision. The null could be true, and we could fail to reject it and make a good decision. Or the null could be false, and we could decide that the null is false. We could reject it and make a good decision. But there's always a possibility that our decision will be wrong, because it is more than possible to pull a sample that either supports the null, that's an unusual sample, or that doesn't support the null, that's an unusual sample. We can always pull a sample that doesn't point us in the right direction. And so that means there's two different types of errors that we could make. So we're going to start with a picture. I call it the decision-making box. There's several different ways you could draw it, and you need to practice drawing the box. So in the box, I'm going to just do a matrix of how our decision about the null could interact with the truth about the null. So over on the left side, I'm going to put the truth about H naught. Okay, we'll divide this up into 4 sections. So on the truth side, one of two things could happen. Either the H naught could be true. So the percentage of students whose moms graduated college is 32%, and it's the truth. Or H naught could be false. So even though I claimed that 32% of the moms went to college, maybe they didn't really. So I could be true, I could be false. So I have a hypothesis, and then after I look at a sample and run some mechanics and get a p-value, I make a decision. So on the other, in the other direction, I'm going to talk about my decisions. So my decision about H naught could go one of two ways. I could get a p-value that's below the alpha level, so below 5% perhaps. And in that case, I would reject the null hypothesis. Or my sample could be closer to the claimed proportion, so I could get a p-value of maybe 20%, 25%, 30%, and fail to reject the H naught. So there are two ways the truth could go, and there's two ways the decision could go. Now, if the null is true and I reject it, I made a mistake. So that's an error. And specifically, it's a type 1 error. So type 1 is when the null is true, but I reject it. So the null says that 32% of moms went to college, but I got a sample that disagreed with it, so I rejected the null hypothesis. I made a mistake. I'll never know that I did because I never really get to know the truth about the population. So the tricky thing about errors is I can make them, but I never really quite know if I did or not. Okay, if the null is true and I don't reject it, if I don't reject it, it means that I'm going to retain it, that I'm going to keep it as the truth. That's a correct decision. That's okay. That's a good thing. We did the right thing there. On the other hand, if the null is false, so the proportion of moms who graduated college isn't really 32%. Okay, so then I rejected the null and said, nope, it's not really 32%. That's a correct decision. So that's okay. I made the right decision. But if the null is false and I don't reject it, I made a wrong decision. So that's a type 2 error. In the case of the jury trial, type 1 error is when the null is true. The dude is innocent, but we reject that and we declare him guilty and we send him to jail. That's a mistake. If he's innocent and we don't reject his innocence, then we're calling him not guilty. We don't have enough evidence to convict. That's a correct decision. But if the dude is guilty, H naught is false. He's not really innocent. And we reject the null and we say, he's not innocent. That's a correct decision. And this is where we really want to land. This piece right here, this check mark, that is the ultimate goal of testing. To prosecute the people who broke the law, to show that the new medicine really is better so that we can help more people, to show that the campaign really did work and we're going to have better results in the future than we had before. On the other hand, in the jury trial, if the dude is guilty, H naught is false, he's guilty, and I fail to reject it, I'm saying that he's innocent. That's an error. So this is where we let the guilty dude go free. Okay, so on the next slide, you have that same picture, but things are sort of in a different order. And I didn't print that one out, but it is in your notes. So we just switched which one was in the column and which one was in the rows, but it's all the same information. So we'll skip to the slide after that and talk about a little bit about probabilities. Okay, so type 1 and type 2 errors have probabilities associated with them. There's certain chances that they can happen. So when H naught is true, dude's innocent, but we reject it, we send him to jail, we make a type 1 error. And the probability of that happening is alpha. And we get to choose the alpha level, or somebody tells us, but if we're the researcher, we really do get the right to choose it, so we can control this one. The idea is, if this is all possible samples, all possible evidence, and I set an alpha level up here at, say, the old 5%, if the null is true, if P is the truth, but I get a sample that lands up here, and I say, oh, I don't believe it, so I'm going to convict him, then I've made an error, and there's a 5% chance that that can happen. So my alpha level is the probability of making that mistake, because that's my reject zone. That's the chance I have of getting a sample in that area. So I have a 5% chance of making that mistake. If I raise my alpha level, I increase my chance of that mistake. So if I move alpha over here and make it 10%, then that means I have twice the probability of making that error. So I want to keep alpha small enough that I don't have a large chance of making the type 1 error. So that's why we never want to go too big for our alpha level. Never below 10% for sure. Okay, on the other hand, when H naught is false and we fail to reject it, so we make the other type of error, that's a different probability, and it's given the name beta. So alpha goes with type 1, beta goes with type 2. Alpha being the first letter of the Greek alphabet and beta being the second letter of the Greek alphabet. That's associated with 1 and 2 in that order. You will never, ever, ever have to calculate beta on the AP exam. It is not in the AP statistics curriculum because it's covered in more advanced statistics courses. The only thing you have to know is that beta is the probability of a type 2 error, and we don't have the tools to calculate that just yet. That's a fairly complicated fellow, so we're just going to leave it at that for now. One last big piece is something called power. We said before that the whole goal of hypothesis testing was to convict the guilty, to reject the false null hypothesis. So when the null is false and we reject it, that's a correct decision, and the power of the test is the probability of doing that. So the power of the test is the probability of correctly rejecting a false null hypothesis. So making that correct decision for a false hypothesis. And the power of that test is 1 minus beta. Again, we don't have to calculate it, but we'll look at a picture to hopefully make it make a little more sense in a few minutes. Okay, so back to the decision-making box again, and that'll probably wrap up this 15-minute video, and we'll have to get a second piece to get the rest. If I look at the decision-making box again, and I'm going to turn it around a little bit this time, and I'm going to put the truth at the top, and two things could happen. H naught could be true, or H naught could be false. And on the side, I'm going to have the decision. And on the decision side, I could reject H naught, or I could fail to reject H naught. If H naught is true and I reject it, that's a wrong decision. So that's a type 1 error because we started with truth, but we made a wrong decision. If H naught is false and we reject it, we've made the right decision. The dude is guilty. We're going to convict. This is good. Not only is it good, this is where the power is. That's the whole purpose of conducting the test. So power is the probability of rejecting a false null. Failing to reject a true null is a good decision. And then failing to reject a false one is a wrong decision. And again, that's a type 2 error. Type 2 error starts with a false assumption and then makes the wrong decision about it. Okay, so we're going to stop this video and look at the last couple of pictures on the next segment.